Johnny and Pauline Falk are adventurous travelers. In 1937, they board the Pan Am Clipper in San Francisco Bay. Pan Am has just begun the first commercial air service across the Pacific. It's no simple task. The small float plane faces an 8,200-mile flight path. It pushes the limits of its range to fly between tiny dots scattered across the Great Sea. Airborne at last, Pauline writes in her diary,
"The flight is so smooth. There's no feeling about it."
After 19 hours, they make their first landing. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. This American territory is barely American. Its people are more rooted in the Pacific. Next stop, Midway. Johnny films an idyllic scene on an island that will soon become infamous.
The Goonie birds are marvelous in the sand dunes.
Their home movies from the Smithsonian archives are among the first color images of these remote American outposts. Then, Wake Island. It's uninhabited until Pan Am turns it into a first-class way station. It's another 11 hours over the open sea to Guam.
The most tropical place yet. Drove to Agana, the largest town.
A small military base protects 20,000 American nationals. The Falks film smiling kids parading in uniform. Their next stop will be a much longer stay.
I find it difficult to leave Manila.
The Philippines have been in U.S. hands since 1898. It's America's most distant territory. The edge of a young empire defined in neon. Past Manila, the Falks finally escape America's reach. Nothing looks familiar. In Hong Kong Harbor, ships have sails like seashells. In China, the boats are simpler. And the people are spellbinding. Finally, exactly 2 months after leaving home, they reach their final destination, Japan. Johnny and Pauline's journey is remarkable, and their path is prophetic. They have crossed an ocean that Ferdinand Magellan named Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. But a wave of war will soon obliterate the folk's footsteps, replacing scenes of peace with scenes of a cataclysm no one can yet imagine.
It looked like you're headed for hell, because you were.
My heart was beating 1,000 times a minute.
They didn't want to be captured. It was either us or them.
Coming towards us was a Japanese plane just skimming over the water.
My eyes were painting with oil, but we got a rope and were taken aboard.
The beach was a mountain.
We didn't think of ourselves as heroes.
It's not just what I remember. It's what I'll never forget.
Philadelphia, 1939. There's a buzz building inside Municipal Stadium. A marching band warms up the crowd on a chilly December day. Then, military formations fill the field. First the Army, then the Navy. Once the field is clear, the battle begins. This is the first known color film of the Army-Navy game. Colonel Wilbur Dockham shoots from his corner seat. Dockham also films his Army unit training at West Point. In 1939, America's military is not very robust. All the services combined have about 600,000 men. Back at the warehouse, everything looks dated, right out of World War I. The average foot soldier still carries a 1903 Springfield rifle. Training is sincere, but not always serious.
I was a radio man. I only fired my rifle once, the whole damn time I was in the Army.
The Army figures less than half of its troops are properly trained. They're barely literate. 75% haven't finished high school, and 41% never started it. Americans greet their military with a collective shrug. When Dockham's unit parades through town, few people stop to watch. It's more sideshow than show of force. Dockham captures it all on color film, a recent invention for home movie buffs and combat cameramen.
I was carrying 2 hand cameras. We were laying on the beach watching this. Guys were getting blown to pieces.
In the 1930s, America is a fragmented society. About the only thing everyone faces in common are the fierce headwinds of the Great Depression. some of America's future soldiers are still school kids. Armand Mafuccio hustles to make a few extra bucks for his family of Italian immigrants.
I'd get up early and work with the baker first. Then after school, I'd go back and help him make the bread. For a few dollars, you'd go any place. You just go get it.
Michael Carilla frequents the movie house to follow the war already raging in Europe.
At the movies, they'd show newsreels showing the fleet and all the warships in a row out there in the ocean.
In 1940, Americans re-elect President Franklin Roosevelt, banking on his promise to stay out of the war. Many feel America should solve its own problems first.
My dad didn't have any work. A lot of time we were wondering where our next meal would come from.
Most people think going to war will be an economic step backward. 2/3 think it will make the next generation worse off. America's focus is inward. Most live out their lives without venturing much beyond the horizon of their own needs. But in a few months, some will venture farther than they ever dreamed.
We had never gone anywhere. Once we got away from home, it was a different world.
Shanghai, China. Here, cultures intersect. It's a Chinese city with an American and British settlement. Streets reveal a global mix of carts and cars. It's an international crossroads, but Japan has it in its crosshairs. In 1937, they invade. Their own film shows parts of Shanghai crumbling in a heap. Japan seizes the Chinese portion, surrounding the Westerners. Then, Japan storms another city. They overwhelm Chinese forces within days, then massacre up to 300,000 citizens. It becomes known as the Rape of Nanking. The Chinese try to carry on amid the rubble. The horrors linger like ghosts. On this pockmarked building, the invaders flaunt their flag like a brand. Japanese soldiers signal a new imperial presence. America wonders if Japan's ambition ends here or extends to one of its own territories nearby.
Sirens in Manila were going off. We began to get a picture that it wasn't looking good.
When the Falks visit the Philippines in 1937, they stay at the Manila Hotel, an upscale haven for expats and foreigners. As Pauline enjoys the warm breeze coming through the hotel window, another family is living upstairs in the penthouse. Little Arthur, his mother Jean, and his father Douglas. These are the personal films of General Douglas MacArthur. He's retired from the U.S. Army, winding down his career by serving as an advisor to the Philippine government. He oversees a joint force of 130,000 Filipino and American troops.
With adequate protection, this country will flourish as a brilliant product of democracy.
But protection is not adequate. Filipino troops are barely trained and poorly equipped.
They had 6-shooter pistols, believe it or not. Colts. They were so old, you couldn't even get ammunition for them.
Robert Brown admits his own American forces aren't much better off.
We had World War I hand grenades. You could pull the pins and hit them with a baseball bat, and they would not go off.
If war breaks out, the Philippines are in grave danger. MacArthur wonders why 16 million American nationals are barely protected.
The apparent disinterest on the part of the United States is incomprehensible.
But if Army officers are worried, they don't show it. At a base south of Manila, Americans carve out a colonial playground. Recreation includes rousing games of bicycle polo. There are some casualties. An assignment in the Philippines appears to be mostly about fun and sun. Soon, it will be about survival.
As I was going out front, I got shot in the leg. And when I looked up, I got shot again, right through my nose.
The epicenter of the coming earthquake is Japan. Its proud history stretches back 2,000 years. It's become wary of encroaching Western influence in Asia, thinking they should be the ones to lead the continent into the future. But Japan is also stuck in the Great Depression, and many think expansion is the only way to crawl out of it.
People are looking for a breakthrough because times were hard, and no one thought of war in a realistic way.
By 1940, the military controls Japan. They have 1.5 million men in uniform, more than double America's forces. The manpower comes from within. The raw materials come from its growing empire.
They lacked sugar, so they took Formosa. They lacked iron, so they took Manchuria. They lacked hard coal and timber, so they invaded China. They lacked security, so they took Korea. They intended, by force of arms if necessary, to establish an economic sphere completely under their own control.
But waves of Japanese expansion have yet to reach here. Hawaii. The famous crossroads sign in Honolulu shows just how far it is from anywhere. In 1941, the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor is just about the only sign that it's an American territory. Mostly, Hawaii hums to its own tune. This is the pre-war footage of Francis Raymond Line, a traveling filmmaker. His color film unspools like a perfect travel brochure.
We discovered a dozen rainbows, some even 2 at a time. Our camera drank in scenes of the harvest. And cattle being loaded by rope and derrick onto ships offshore at the Parker Ranch.
Hawaii has its own way of doing things. It's not used to cultural convulsions. Change usually comes on the slow boat. Francis Line's film paints Hawaii as nearly perfect. It's paradise framed by crashing waves. A roaring perimeter with wondrous views of the Pacific curving out of sight. Beyond Hawaii's horizon line, Japanese cameras film an armada secretly slicing its way through the Pacific. It's December 6th, 1941. The American military is on alert, but not up to speed. On this very day, one unit has no hand grenades to practice with. Instead, they throw eggs. Also, on December 6th, newspaper ads call on congressmen to keep America out of the war across the Atlantic. It's the other ocean that's about to explode. Pearl Harbor goes to sleep, innocent and unscathed, for the last time. The next morning, one colonel is up early and assumes he's watching a military exercise.
Very realistic maneuvers. I wonder what the Marines are doing to the Navy so early on Sunday.
This is considered the only color footage of the attack on Pearl Harbor, shot by sailor Clyde Daughtry. The film is badly damaged, but the chaos is clear. William Lockey is just 1 week out of basic training aboard the USS New Orleans.
I said, let's get the guns loaded. They said, we got no ammunition. Who's got the key? We don't know.
Surprised sailors fire their anti-aircraft guns wildly, killing some civilians up in the hills. Radio stations begin shouting that it's not a drill.
The city of Honolulu has also been attacked. It is no joke, it is the real war.
The USS Oglala is listing badly. One sailor on deck is shot through the face by a strafing Japanese plane. Other crews are faring far worse. The USS Shaw bursts into a fireball.
The boys were out there in the water in all that oil. They'd come up, knock the oil out of their way and catch a breath, then go back down.
In 1 hour and 15 minutes, Japan damages or sinks 19 ships and kills 2,400. The news ripples outward like a shockwave. A Pan Am clipper full of tourists is out over the Pacific, which is suddenly a war zone. They turn off their lights, blacken their windows, and change course. All over the country, military phones light up. Jack Lent is on duty in San Diego.
Some colonel was on the phone. He said, "You get your commanding officer and tell him that Pearl Harbor's just been bombed." I said, "Yes, sir. What's Pearl Harbor?"
Behind closed doors on a Sunday, President Roosevelt is composing a short speech in his head. He resists advice to give it today. Instead, Eleanor Roosevelt steps up to a microphone and gives the first official American response.
You cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape a clutch of fear at your heart. And yet I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears.
Many Americans do not. The FBI switchboard lights up with calls reporting suspicious behavior of Japanese Americans. In New York City, Japanese restaurant owners tell their patrons to finish their meals. Then they shutter their doors and drive each other home in convoys for safety. In San Francisco, people report everything from strange airplanes in the sky to shady men on the streetcars. Sirens wail for no apparent reason. In Seattle, 2,000 people descend upon downtown to enforce a blackout. It devolves into looting. In Hawaii, radio stations declare the islands are now under martial law. Then they order a complete blackout.
Turn out your lights. This means the whole territory. Turn out your lights and do not turn them on for any purpose whatsoever.
America is on its heels, and Japan isn't finished. The next 48 hours shock the world. Just hours after attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launch a surprise assault on the American base on Wake Island. Fearing a land invasion, a Pan Am Clipper captain jams 70 civilians onto his plane. Way overweight, the plane finally gets off the water on the third try. Then, Japan bombs the U.S. military base on Guam that the Falks filmed a few years earlier. In 3 days, they capture the island and take 20,000 American nationals prisoner. Also on December 7th, Japan invades the Gilbert Islands, a British colony. They also fall in 3 days. Japanese forces on the way back from Pearl Harbor shell Midway Island. Repelling fire drives them off, but not before the American base takes a hit. Japan is thrusting a sword deep into the Central Pacific, a violent blitz that takes the ocean by storm. At the same time, Japan's own film captures a surge into Asia. They begin bombing the Philippines on December 8th. On the same day, they invade Thailand and soon roll into Bangkok. They attack the British colonies of Hong Kong and Singapore. And they storm the rest of Shanghai, overrunning the British and American enclave. Stuck on a small base in China is a company of U.S. Marines, now completely surrounded by the Japanese. Superiors order them to surrender without a fight. Sergeant Robert Smith marches into captivity as the victors switch out the flag.
Look what's up there now. A flaming red asshole.
Before the world can react, Japan cleaves its way into Southeast Asia. They light the fuse of war all around the Pacific. In Japan, many citizens are flush with pride. But there's an undercurrent of anxiety.
We were assured we would not have to worry. America was a democratic nation, and so disintegrate and collapse. They can't unite for a common purpose. One blow against them, and they'll fall to pieces.
Back in Washington, Roosevelt addresses Congress.
Yesterday, December 7th,
First, he makes a few last-minute revisions.
a date which will live in infamy.
For years, the nation felt stuck. Now, it feels stung.
There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger.
America is at war. Most didn't want it, but most will have to join it, either in support at home or in uniform beyond.
There were college men who joined the service that very day. They left letters with the manager of the dormitory and they took off. The feeling of the moment was, I would like to fly a plane and drop a bomb on the bastards.
That trip to West Virginia to have my physical was the first time I was ever out of the state of Ohio. Roughest ride I ever had in my life. Like traveling on a gravel road for 2,000 miles. I swear, they had square wheels.
My examination took probably 30 seconds. Drop my pants, check forward and aft, check and see if I'm breathing. Son, you're ready to go.
I didn't pass because the guy handed me a book and said, read the numbers. I only saw dots. He said, I can't take you. You're colorblind. I said, well, what am I supposed to see? He said a 3, 5, and 9. So I hitchhiked to Indianapolis, got in line. They gave me the same book, and I said, I see a 3, 5, and 9. They said, you're in.
Armand Mafuccio, the kid who baked his way through the Depression, joins the Navy. They don't waste his talent.
All we made was the bread, rolls, and desserts for the crew. Of course, there were 2,000 sailors.
Michael Kurilla, who admired Navy ships in the newsreels, also takes the plunge.
They gave us our uniforms and everything. They gave us our caps. Then they'd give us our haircuts, and the caps didn't fit anymore. Our ears were holding them up.
First stop, the pool. They practice treading water, while someone tries to hold them under. But deeper water awaits in an unlikely place. These are cadets in Northwestern University's Naval Reserve Midshipmen's School near Chicago. They are called 90-day wonders because that's how fast the program is in wartime. Lake Michigan isn't exactly the Pacific Ocean, but it'll have to do. They study navigation and the fine art of swabbing the deck. They are literally learning the ropes. Finally, they practice the choreography of gun work. Now, they have time to break it down step by step. Soon, they won't.
They peeled off and dove on us. They got close.
The Army picks a training spot that could at least pass for the Pacific: the Florida Swamp. This is Waukulla Springs near Tallahassee, where Hollywood filmed some of the jungle scenes in Tarzan movies. Now, the Army is filming its own recruits, trying to master an environment more common in New Guinea than North America. The horrors of Pearl Harbor inform a few of the drills. Smokescreen maneuvers, swimming around an oil fire. This is not the Army Thomas Bay had in mind.
I chose the Army over the Navy because I'm scared of the water. I didn't know how to swim.
No one quite knows what fighting across an ocean will look like. They ford a river by making a hand bridge of rifles. They use their tents and poles to make a supply raft. They practice hiding from the enemy with synchronized ducking. And, predictably, they blow stuff up. Underwater demolition teams try to smooth the way for a new kind of boat. This is an early amphibious vehicle, a duck made by General Motors. Driving through the water is a novelty. Soon, it will be a necessity.
We walked into a hornet's nest. I was thinking, how in the world did I ever get sucked into this mess?
The Navy recruiting office was jammed up with 70 new recruits, so I went around the corner and the Marine Corps had a little shingle out. And I was it. There was no line.
The first thing we heard when the bus came through the gate that morning was, "You'll be sorry."
Before the war, the Marine Corps was struggling for relevance. Some thought the Army should just absorb it. It was a service without a purpose, derided as the foster home for Navy flunkies.
The first 3 weeks were terrible. They insisted on teaching us how to walk, and I felt we already knew.
The Marine Corps wants to shed its reputation as a military afterthought. Instead of the weakest, they want to become the toughest.
Every Marine, before he was anything else, was a rifleman. If you're a tank driver, pilot, cook, we don't care what else you are. First of all, you're a rifleman.
They'll be using their rifles as part of a new tactic: the amphibious assault. The Marine Corps adopted this doctrine only 6 years earlier, with a publication called Tentative Manual for Landing Operations. They can't afford to be tentative anymore. The doctrine was in search of a war, and now it's here. Just as they're cracking the book on how to do it. As they rehearse storming a beach in North Carolina, it looks clunky. This ramp door jams, and Marines have to pile out over the sides. Some experts consider the whole idea complete folly.
We had no idea in the world how we were going to use this type of training.
In 1940, there are fewer than 30,000 active duty Marines, total. In just 3 years, that'll be the number invading a single Pacific island. None of these guys can really see that coming.
We just thought the Japanese couldn't possibly carry on a very long war. We thought it would be over in a matter of weeks.
The Japs whipped us for 3 solid weeks. We couldn't move more than 2 yards a day. It was just hell, day and night.
This is your ship.
Look at her. She's a symbol of our American industrial skill.
That skill is now under the gun. The Navy needs thousands more ships. Fast. In Portland, Oregon, shipyards grow like weeds. Industrialist Henry Kaiser owns 3 of them. This is Kaiser's own film of his Portland operation. He builds mostly Liberty ships, cargo and transport vessels that will carry the war across the Pacific. Workers come from all over the country, men, women, and entire families. Kaiser builds a town near Portland just to house them all, Vanport City. Population 42,000. Many just call it Kaiserville. By the end of 1941, nearly half of America's heavy industry workforce is working on defense contracts. Bullets in Indiana, rivets in Kansas City, parachutes in Utah. But not all war weapons are built from scratch.
War had exploded over the entire world. Every Pan-American route was now a war route.
The Pan Am Clipper, the same airplane that brought the Falks to Asia in peacetime, becomes a wartime workhorse. They're still the only planes that can carry a big load across an ocean. So the company becomes a de facto wing of the U.S. military. And all crews get new uniforms to match.
As soon as I was outfitted in these uniforms, they took my picture from my personnel folder. We called them our obituary photos. You can guess why.
As Clippers get baptized into war with a new camouflage paint job, the world awaits Japan's next move. It's eyeing up more islands to expand its empire. Java and Timor have important resources to harvest. Standing in the way is the small air and naval base in Darwin. On a sunny Thursday morning, Japan slashes into northern Australia. By the time sailor Monty Tuckerman grabs his camera, the Japanese planes are gone. It's the only color footage of the raid on Darwin, a surprise attack considered to be Australia's Pearl Harbor.
With one big crash, they dropped their entire loads. With a noise like the roll of heavy thunder, red and yellow flame shot into the air.
11 ships belch out their last breath of acrid smoke before disappearing undersea. The Japanese don't stop at the harbor. They bomb buildings in town. People run for the hills, fearing a land invasion. The attack kills 235 and injures hundreds more, all in a town of only 2,000. Clouds of war now rise over a nervous Australia, a nation right in the shadows of an expanding and unpredictable empire. Newsreels from the Philippines show Japanese arriving in waves and Americans scattering like ants.
They handed each one of us a can. I got a can of cherries. And they said, disperse. I mean, we just dispersed. We didn't know what the hell we were doing.
There's no color footage of the brutal fight for the Philippines. Cornered on the Bataan Peninsula, Americans have little food and no reinforcements. MacArthur holds out on Corregidor. Japanese film shows their overwhelming advantage. Soon, they're celebrating in Manila. MacArthur and his family escape to Australia as Corregidor falls. Those left in the Philippines are no longer enjoying a sunny deployment. They're enduring their darkest nightmare. These very boys are now dead, starving, or captured.
That was something I told my mother that would never happen. I'd be behind the front lines. Wrong. Dead wrong.
Japan has uncoiled a ferocious, multi-pronged attack across land and sea in several directions. The U.S. is still creating its wartime organizational chart. Roosevelt puts the Southwest Pacific into General MacArthur's hands. He's already glaring at the Philippines with revenge in his eyes. The vast open seas of the Central Pacific will be under Navy Admiral Chester Nimitz. The two men could scarcely be more different. Nimitz is a soft-spoken leader by example who shuns attention. He loathes PR men who suggest he show more pizzazz. In contrast, MacArthur is a man of sweeping statements, grand gestures, and a fondness for any recording device that can capture them. These top men from the Army and Navy now have the Pacific War on their shoulders. Like the football game between their services, it'll be part camaraderie, part competition. But their boss calls the first play. Back in December, President Roosevelt issued a secret order after the Pearl Harbor attack. Find a way to strike back at Japan. It takes 4 months to figure out how. The distance is daunting. The technology is lacking. But they pull together a plan that's part bravado, part desperation. Ships cut through a stormy Pacific in radio silence, just as the Japanese did coming the other way. American carriers haven't yet come of age. This one's only big enough to launch a scout plane with a catapult. To bomb Japan, they'll have to launch a bigger plane off this deck, a B-25. They've never tried it.
We hadn't actually flown off a carrier before. I wondered, could I get out of that damn airplane if we go off the end of the flight deck?
Bombardier Herb Mesha scrapes the waves and gets airborne by a whisker. There's no turning back. The deck is too short to land on. 16 planes are off to Japan on a wing and a prayer. It's called the Doolittle Raid for the colonel who leads it. There's no footage of the raid itself. Some bombs hit Tokyo, but damage is minimal. Most planes go on to crash land in China. As payback for Pearl Harbor, it hardly rates. America doesn't care.
Doolittle and his gallant men shake the complacency of the Japanese warlords.
It will take more than a few bombs to win the Pacific War. It will take weapons yet to be built, teamwork yet to be tested, and blood yet to be spilled. For now, the combatants remain an ocean apart. But soon, the Pacific War will move beyond rushing across the sea for sneak attacks. Instead, it will collide with gruesome force, with young men meeting face to face to slug it out.
I was scared to death. Ice water in my veins. The only reason I could move was because the rest of them were.
I am pleased to think that I will die in true samurai style. I feel now like a full-fledged warrior.
The stakes are unblinkingly clear. Succeed and control a third of the globe. Fail and crash into the abyss.